Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name's Dan Watson. I'm an urban planner and a member of the organizing committee for the City Debates. And I volunteered first with Urbanarium back in 2016 at the door. So I'm happy to be here again and great to have you all join us today. Welcome to the 17th Urbanarium UBC-SALA City Debate. Urbanarium acknowledges that Metro Vancouver is on the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of 10 First Nations, including Katzie, Kwantlen, Kwikwetlam, Matsqui, Musqueam, Kakite, Semiahmoo, Squamish, Swasin, and Tsleil-Waututh. Our system of land use has its roots in the colonization of Metro Vancouver and continues to impact and displace Indigenous peoples. As an organization that focuses on urban issues, Urbanarium is committed to responding to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to action and in taking further steps to advancing truth and reconciliation through public programming. I'd like to thank our volunteers and the panelists for being here, as well as the members of the debate committee, Marta Fairvag, Bryce Rossich, and Michael Mortensen. And our sponsor for this evening, Wrenwood Development Advisors. Thank you to Jeff Wren of Wrenwood and to the UBC Faculty of Applied Sciences. We invite you to join the conversation and share your thoughts about the debate and topic on social media. You can find us using the hashtag UrbanariumVote on the website formerly known as Twitter @Urbanarium and Instagram @UrbanariumVan. And next, it's my honor to introduce our series moderator and friend, Frances Bula. This is Frances's third time moderating a city debate. She's an award-winning journalist specializing in urban issues and city politics in the Vancouver region, which she's covered since 1994. She writes for the Globe and Mail's BC section and the Report on Business. She's written for the Vancouver Sun, BC Business, Canadian Architect, Canadian Business, Georgia Straight, and many other news sources. She's also recently served as a decoding density jury member for us. Please give a warm round of applause for Frances Bula.
Great. This is so exciting that you're all here and not at home watching the debate. By the way, my journalism friends who are watching it are sending updates for me. Jesus, they all look pale and sound out of touch. I can't find a lead yet. Oh, he looks like a cadaver. Oh my God. This leader just threw all homeowners under the bus. So anyway, things to look forward to when you get out of here. Hang on. Okay, so first of all, before I do a little kind of opener, this is our motion that you're all going to be voting on in a few minutes. You vote at the beginning, and then you vote again at the end. And whichever team changes the most minds wins. And they don't have to change very many necessarily, and they could still lose the overall vote, but whoever changes the most wins. So the Oxford style of debating requires a resolution that is argued strongly by one side and strongly by the other. So, no nuance here. It's going to be black and white. Simplify things for all of us. And I will explain a bit more of the rules, but first I'm gonna blabber away here for a bit. And I think a lot of people, I saw a lot of friends in the audience already. It's great to see such a mix of people out, so many young people for whom this is a really critical issue. And as they said, I've been covering city politics and development and housing for 30 years and seen unbelievable change. I feel like some ancient elder saying, I remember when the federal government wouldn't even consider giving a GST rental rate rebate. That was the way it was for 20 years, and then all of a sudden they changed. So the topic tonight is the province was right to assert its authority on land use. And I have to say, I think this title probably baffled a few people at first, because we haven't really in the past thought of the province as having a huge amount of authority over land use, because it has exerted it relatively rarely until now, unlike Ontario, where you've seen more examples. But now, as everyone grapples with how much authority the province has, it is raising big questions among you in the audience, and with many others, about whether cities have had too much power, and especially the power to make fine-grained decisions about new building and to consult the local public, which some of you will see as code for telling me what window frames I have to listen, put in, and which 6 people on either side of me I have to listen to. And many others are worried that the province's blanket rezonings don't respect local geographic, infrastructure, or livability issues. So you're going to hear about that. On the other hand, others tonight will argue that cities brought this on themselves by endlessly delaying or shutting off possibilities for new housing with fussing over process and minor design details and the loud voices of a dozen neighbors who don't like change. For sure, some you'll hear tonight that some will say the province has no right to do any of this, that it's anti-democratic. Others will say it's always had that right. You just forgot that it did because it was exerted, as I said, so rarely. And just going back in history, this is me living history, I remember that when the NDP were thinking about putting a casino on the waterfront in the 90s, yes, I am old, then Mayor Philip Owen and his staff organized huge public information sessions, really opposition rallying sessions on the issue. And the basic idea that you always heard in these sessions was that ultimately the city controlled land use and would do so in this case. There have been other occasions where we've seen expropriation, or a case where the province wants to give some piece of land in a regional district to an Indigenous nation as part of a reconciliation effort. Again, these happen so infrequently that they didn't really disrupt the sense that local governments largely controlled all land decisions. And even the creation of the Agricultural Land Reserve in the Islands Trust by the province, both done by a provincial governments unhappy about how local councils were handling land issues, are so far back in the past, the 70s, which is actually before I started reporting, that we've forgotten the province has those powers. In other cases, like the province's decision to disallow local governments from regulating farming or from preventing single-family homes from being used for small daycares, have been similarly forgotten. As I said, in Ontario, it's quite different. BC certainly hasn't had anything like what are called MZOs, Minister's Zoning Orders, in Ontario, where the province can order a city to allow more density on a specific site. And quite frankly, the cities sometimes use it themselves to get around their own local councils and local processes. Nor has it seen the kind of crude reorganization of cities that provinces have the power to do, which Ontario has again exerted more than elsewhere by offloading social housing from the province to the cities and forcing amalgamation in Toronto in 1998, or by unilaterally reducing the number of councillors in 2018. So in contrast, BC's own government website, in its page on land use regulation, spells out various ways how municipal councils shape land use. And one quote from their own page, local government land use regulations, including zoning and other bylaws, e.g. parking and loading, sign and screening and landscaping bylaws, enable local governments to implement the long-term vision described in their regional growth strategies, official community plans, or other planning tools. That's a quote from the government website. Planners, please stop crying. Put your Kleenexes away. Nowhere on that page does it suggest that, in fact, the province can come in and override any of that. One part, the Local Government Act, specifically allows an override of bylaws considered to be contrary to the public interest of British Columbia. I won't go over all the fine points about what the province has done or hasn't done in the past and various legal decisions. There's a lot of great municipal law firms who have been analyzing a lot of this since the province went into high gear on running land use. And many of these decisions that I'm referring to are discussed in an excellent paper from Young and Anderson that they wrote in 2022 as things were getting started here. So the reality is that BC can override in various ways, and now it is doing that following the lead of places like California or New Zealand, where state and national governments have stepped in to require, incentivize, or simply legalize different forms of housing. And we've seen, various cities do this as well. To people in Vancouver, I think the question might be, the city was wrong to assert that it can do whatever it wants when it comes to land use, because, there are a lot of complaints about the Broadway plan, for example, and the sort of unilateral decisions taken there and how arbitrary some of the decisions are about where tall buildings will go and so on. So it's not something that's unique to the province. Cities have been taking, some cities have been taking a much more assertive role, so much to the dismay of local people who say, that's fine if you want density, set the target, but let the local community decide. Again, you'll hear that argument at the provincial level. That's fine, go ahead and set the target, but let the local council and the residents of that community decide, as long as they're not just trying to, rook you and do an end run around housing targets or whatever. The point I was going to make is that, the question for tonight is the province right to exert that underlying power they have and take over some part of land use decision-making from cities for what might be considered the public good? The takeover has resulted in some huge upheavals already and a lot of confusion on numerous issues. Because it isn't just that the province has mandated that, for example, multiplexes be allowed on any formerly single-family lot in every city over 10,000. It's not just that it has mandated significant density around transit hubs, and it's not just that it is saying it will remove a requirement for public hearing for many types of housing projects. It's that there's still a lack of clarity about all these and more. What power does the city now still have to block a multiplex or cluster of them if engineering decides it would require a sewer upgrade and the city doesn't have the money? What power does the city have to negotiate for better design in a tower going in near a transit hub? Where are the points in the process where regular residents can have a say in what is being built, or is that completely by the board? I, for one, still haven't managed to get an answer I feel like I fully understand about when rezonings with public hearings can still take place and when they can't. I'm hoping to get some clarity tonight, and maybe some of you are. And it's possibly because I get messages like this explaining the process. So I asked the City of Vancouver's comms department, and I don't blame them. They're just trying to do their best. Can you explain to me, are there going to be rezonings and public hearings or not going forward? And this is the answer. It's a little bit long, but I'm sure you'll love it for the poetic language. The TOA bylaw designates the TOAs identified in provincial legislation, but does not change existing zoning. Landowners are still required to submit a rezoning application, either a standard CD1 or rezone to an existing RR district schedule, if they would like to achieve the height and/or density under the TOA rezoning policy, which includes an inclusionary housing requirement. Other planning initiatives are currently underway for future city-initiated zoning changes impacting some of these TOAs. However, they will require a public hearing and council approval prior to any zoning changes being made. So maybe we can have a vote on what is happening. So tonight we're going to learn a lot more about all of this and go beyond some of the kind of simplistic slogans we've heard, a bit from both sides about the pros and cons of the province acting so assertively. More assertively, I have to say, than even places like California, where the state government's intervention still largely focuses on getting cities to set out housing targets and show how they'll meet them. They do not, by and large, mandate the kind of multiplex or density that this province is doing on top of the housing targets. So this is a big change that's happening in this province. It's something other provinces and cities are watching, and we'll hear tonight about what to watch out for. So that's the intro. Now we're going to vote, have our first vote. I hope I didn't unduly sway anyone already. So you're going to vote on pro or con on the motion, a simple yes or no. Then each member of our two-person debate team will give their opening statements of 7 minutes. Then I'll moderate an exchange period where they get to, the debaters can sort of talk, or argue amongst themselves, ask questions directly, and members of the audience will get a chance to do some questioning too. Each debater will get a closing statement of 2 minutes, and when the debate is completed, you vote again. The team that wins the debate, as I said, is the one that changes the most minds. So let's get going, and I now invite you to cast your vote, and you can either do it through the QR code here, or if you need a paper ballot, there are people circulating who can give you a paper ballot. So if maybe we could have the lights up just in case people's hands go up and they need a paper ballot. So go ahead and vote. Oh, thank you. Okay, kids. Hello. You've all voted, or as many of you as have voted as we're going to count. So the first vote is pro, 80%, and con, who does math here? 20%. So I must warn you that in the last debate that we had, there were similar results at the beginning, and there was an amazing swing. Just to let you know that those of you who are like, I'm checking out, this is boring, and we can see how it's going, there can be surprises here. So there it is, 80-20. What's the difference going to be by the end of the evening? So government has gone too far, right? That's what everyone voted? Provincial government has gone too far. Okay, so you're all voting Conservative. We know how things are going, and we'll see you tomorrow. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce the speakers. So arguing the pro position tonight, this is all written out for me. I didn't choose who comes first. So Helen Loy is a development professional with experience in non-market and market developments. She hosts the Urbanism Vancouver podcast and is currently the Director of Development at KPU Communities Trust. She advocates for abundant and affordable housing with a focus on equitable, sustainable, and livable cities. And I have to say, she fights a valiant fight on Twitter to, make nuanced points in all of these issues. So, and her teammate is Russil Wvong, who is a software developer who spends a lot of time, that was in all caps, I didn't write that, a lot of time arguing that we desperately need more housing. He volunteers with Abundant Housing Vancouver and the Vancouver Area Neighbours Association and ran for City Council with Forward Together in 2022. His daily newsletter is morehousing.ca. I've been pleased to interview him a number of times for stories, so welcome them to the stage, Helen and Russil. I think they were supposed to be playing the Beyonce song, but sorry about that. So
You can imagine it.
And now arguing against the resolution are two very nice people you're going to want to listen to. Andrew Merrill is the General Manager of Planning and Development for the City of Coquitlam. Originally from the East Coast, he has a Master's in Planning with a concentration in Urban Design from UBC. He has over 19 years of experience in community planning, development approvals, public engagement, facilitating housing affordability, and urban design, and soon to be infrastructure inventory, I understand, is his new specialty. So his current work involves leading a team of 130 planners and building officials, guiding transit-oriented development and infill housing for Coquitlam, which is an incredibly quickly growing community just east of Vancouver here. And his teammate is Sarah Ellis, who began her 10-plus year career in housing as a volunteer advocate for renters' rights in Boston. She has a master's degree in public policy from the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and has worked in housing policy in the US and Canada, notably as a housing planner for the City of Vancouver, where she spearheaded the 10-year housing strategy and chaired the Metro Vancouver Housing Subcommittee. Sarah is currently the Executive Director of the Squamish Community Housing Society and also serves on the boards of Small Housing BC and our Squamish Placemaking Society. Welcome, Andrew and Sarah. So, as I said, each debater gets 7 minutes. And we're going to start with Helen. Go for it.
Thank you, Urbanarium, for having me tonight. I feel like we just did the vote, and I don't think we need to do another one anymore. I'm excited to kick this off on the pro side. And I want to start somewhere that's maybe not as debated, right? I think we can all agree that our goal is to have more livable, sustainable communities. And in order to do that, we need a little bit of density. We need abundant and affordable housing, as well as lots of good public services and amenities. So with that in mind, I want to take a look at how we have been doing. I'm going to argue not so hot. As some of you may know, there's some kind of sketchy origins for why we have local land use control. One of the key reasons why local land use authority was established was really to restrict and limit the development of apartments, because by doing this, they would be able to limit and segregate the people who lived in apartments, who tend to be people of lower income families, minorities, or anyone else who was deemed undesirable by social norms. So you fast forward throughout the decades, and you've sort of seen numerous ways in which this continues to manifest very specific interests. You've got politicians and policies that respond to very local voices because they have to, they're on the ground. But unsurprisingly, these voices also, again, tend to be folks who are more securely housed, they're wealthier, probably older, just because they have more time and capacity. They're not working like 2 jobs while also trying to finish their degree. So what we've created is this sort of negative feedback loop against housing and development, even if it doesn't serve our collective interests. And I think that's one of the key reasons why we have a housing shortage and an increased gap between the haves and have-nots. I want to take a look at one specific example that I worked on, which kind of shows this process in practice, right? I worked on a project named The Springs in Port Moody, which was a project that delivered 55 affordable homes. It created a new church and community space for a local church that gifted the land into the project. And then it created new offices for 2 local nonprofit community organizations that served children with disabilities and their families. So I think in terms of quality of projects, this is like pretty up there. And to build this project, we had to obtain a rezoning, a development permit, and a building permit. How long did this project take in total? Well, the rezoning in itself took about 3 years, and that didn't include the 2 years of lead up of all the partners coming together, finding the funding, doing the feasibility, and coming together to even start a rezoning. Development and building permit took over a year, and then construction itself took about 3 years. So all in all, it took a decade just to build 55 homes. And I think this is emblematic of the existing process when we have local land use authority. So I think these are some of the key reasons why the province has decided to step in, with the key goal of creating more housing than what the cities have been permitting, because so far it's just simply been not good enough. So what are some of the concerns or responses that you might hear from my colleagues over here? Some of them might say that we've already been adding a lot of new housing. I would argue that it's nowhere near enough because we still have a pesky little problem called the housing crisis. Some of them may feel that some of these policies don't make sense. You draw an 800-meter circle and some of it may land in water, which is fair. But I think the point is that they're meant to be guidelines and that they set us a new baseline, and that some of it is up to interpretation and application and negotiation and subjective debate, just like rezoning policies. And lastly, I think cities may argue that we primarily use new, denser developments to fund a lot of capital upgrades and much needed infrastructure. Because after all, we can't just let greedy developers get all the profit, right? I would argue that we need to challenge our approach on this. While we're taxing new housing, and therefore the people who've just managed to save up and move out, a whole bunch of other people who just happen to buy in at the right time get to amass all of their wealth and see if not 10 but hundreds-fold return on the value of their home. And if we all use our infrastructure and denser communities are more cost-effective to service, then why should only some of us pay for it? I think that there are also a few examples of why the province's action has been really good and really important. The first one of Bill 44 is an example where we've removed single-family zoning, which again is something that planners had already been working towards at the city, and I think that the province just kind of came in and one fell swoop aligned all of that with a new baseline. Bill 47 of transit-oriented areas leverages, again, our existing better infrastructure to build complete communities and add much-needed new homes. And then lastly, most importantly, putting in housing targets ensures that we're not just planning for what we'd like to do, but ensuring that our cities, our communities, and our provinces are actually accountable to the plans that we make. There's obviously a whole bunch of other policies like Francis alluded to, and I don't think any of them are perfect, but I do think that this moves us in the right direction and it responds with the correct amount of urgency that was previously missing. Most importantly, housing is actually good and we need to add a lot more of it. And by removing local control, this will get us more of the good thing, which is housing. I'd argue that cities have had decades, if not almost a century, to get it right. And unfortunately, we're still dealing with a housing crisis and increased wealth inequity, and it's just not serving us in our communities. And that's why I think the province was right to step in and focus us on a new direction with some new ground rules.
Okay, and next, we'll hear a total rebuttal to all of that from Andrew Merrill.
Okay, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Helen. It's funny, I was listening, I'm like, okay, I should probably change everything I'm speaking to rebuttal, but I've got to do my intro part first. So it's, interesting. I, like to think of myself as actually radically pro-housing, but I'm also pro-local government. And pro understanding your neighborhood and your context. In my career as a planner, learning that planning is complex, and our housing crisis is one of those wicked societal problems that's multifaceted and complex, and needs complex solutions to solve it, and just easy kind of broad brush statements won't solve it, and haven't, and that's going to lead to continued problems. Planners are particularly positioned to understand their communities and how housing rolls out, and focus on that public good of more housing, but in a way that's locally appropriate and can balance all of the things we need from infrastructure and amenities and context and in the environment and the local geography. And that allows planners to really kind of balance those needs for their communities going forward. So one of the ways I want to talk about doing that is through really robust community engagement. In Coquitlam, we have a history of really extensive community engagement through our neighborhood planning program. The example here, this is a photo from an event for the Burquitlam Lougheed neighborhood plan. If anyone's been to Burquitlam lately, there's all kinds of construction and new housing going on. But this is a program where over several years, taking communities that may have been adverse to development at first, working with them, having those conversations, doing engagement, advocating for more housing, talking about why the community is evolving, brought those communities on side so that we could align council and staff, the development community, and the neighborhood all around how the community was going to grow and change. And that paved the path forward to allow a whole bunch of development applications to happen with very little consternation or very little opposition. In fact, we had many public hearings where one or two people would come out to talk about a project, and half the time they'd be in favor of it, partly because they would say, it's according to the plan you talked to us about. And it was those conversations that allow us to build that consensus so we're all rowing in the same direction, and it leads to long-lasting change. The sort of top-down planning that you see it isn't sticky. It doesn't last for very long. We have a history of seeing top-down planning, whether that was urban renewal and the urban freeway expansions in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, led to lots of problems and led to some of the reasons why local governments spend more time thinking about how planning happens in their communities and how their communities grow. But it's all in how you set it up. We start the question with the community, not whether your community should grow, but how your community should evolve. You're next to a SkyTrain station. I will go and say, your community will evolve. Let's talk about how that happens. And I want to understand your perspectives and your priorities so I can include those in the plan, and then we can all go forward and build a community that everyone's proud of and happy of, and it doesn't lead to the sort of opposition that we see in other communities, or I'm seeing right now where people are reacting strongly against top-down planning by the province, sort of mandating a number of things. What's interesting about this photo is you'll see everyone in there wearing white t-shirts. They're all from a neighborhood, and it all says Area A equals high density, and they were all there to advocate to us as the planners for even more density and more housing than we were initially proposing. And that's partly that power of really robust and deep and meaningful engagement, is it allows you to bring communities on side and break down those barriers so that everyone understands why the community is growing and changing. And I think it's so important because then you lead to that long-lasting change. This is just a photo of a part of Coquitlam. And again, talking about that really long-term, robust history of neighborhood planning. Over my tenure over probably the last decade in Coquitlam, we'd already been redesignating almost 800 acres of areas that were previously single-family to higher and better uses. And unlike Burnaby, where they've got the grand bargain of the 80-story tower next to the SkyTrain and the 1960s bungalow a block away, we really feathered that out into the neighborhood and had lots of low-rise apartments and townhouses and multiplexes. We were already doing that, but in a way where we could balance that with the servicing and amenities that we need to service those communities to make sure that they're livable. And everyone was on side with that, and everyone agreed that that was the approach. And that led to significant development volume. We had hundreds of thousands of development capacity created and tens of thousands of units under development that were proceeding. So in a very pro-growth municipality with proactive planning, we were able to use the existing tools that we had to facilitate lots of housing growth. Then the province came in and took a very broad brush approach to planning across the province with a very kind of top-down focus. I've heard a colleague of mine, Don Limas from the city of Surrey, called it planning by chainsaw, not scalpel. But it kind of treated everyone the same. And it led to a lot of challenges around how do we reconcile this kind of top-down heavy approach that doesn't fit with our current system. We spent the last year really retooling our current planning system just to get us back to where we were. But it's led to a lot of unintended consequences in terms of how development's happening. As you spread it out over a larger area, it removes that link from us being able to say, okay, we're getting funding for amenities and infrastructure from development and the tax base in our community to fund the things we need. As I spread that very thinly across the city, I'm not able to target those investments and make the best use of those limited public dollars. I now have to fund development and growth over a much larger geographic area, and it makes it much harder to service and is going to lead to inefficient use of infrastructure or higher costs for everyone because we're not able to target those types of big public investments. It's also the way the province kind of developed things wasn't a lot of consultation. A lot of it was done in secret. And still, even a year later, the province hasn't released all the policy guides to tell us or the development community how to interpret the legislation and actually write the rules to implement it. So that process quite clumsy, and I like to think that good public policy should be able to stand up to public scrutiny and not necessarily be done in secret and just imposed on people without a lot of debate or discussion. Talking about development volume, we've seen lots of that in Coquitlam. We've seen actually that tail off as we've had this period of misunderstanding and people not really understanding what the rules are. They don't know how to value projects and can't move ahead. And that's causing challenges with infrastructure and servicing. As I talked about, spreading it across really creates challenges. If I could service 5 fourplexes on one block, it makes sense, but 5 of them on 5 corners of the city make it really challenging and expensive to service and isn't a good use of our limited public infrastructure dollars. Thank you.
So some excellent points there, and now we'll hear from Russil.
So we need more housing. When we have lots of jobs and not enough housing, prices and rents have to rise to unbearable levels to push people out. On the left, we see how home prices have risen since the early 2000s, and that it's gotten especially bad since COVID. On the right, we see that high housing costs act like a barrier keeping people out. You have to have a high income to move here. Because housing costs are so high, real incomes for renters and first-time homebuyers are low. After you pay for rent or a mortgage, there's not much left over. It's hard to convince someone to work for low pay, so we also get labor shortages. Even if you're an older homeowner, this is a bad situation. How's the healthcare system going to work when nurses retire and hospitals can't find new ones? After COVID, the housing shortage is no longer confined to the Lower Mainland. It's like it's spilled over, with prices rising much more in the rest of the province. Suddenly, there were a lot of people working remotely, needing more space at home, and willing to move. When remote workers move from Vancouver to Nelson or to Nanaimo, it's great for them, but it's bad for local renters and homebuyers. It's like they're now suburbs of Vancouver, with prices and rents to match. It's not just the big cities. We need to build more housing everywhere. Even if we cut way back on population growth, which is happening now at the federal level, our pre-COVID housing stock simply doesn't line up with where people want to live and work. Per capita, home building in BC peaked in the 1970s and never recovered. But this is fixable. We have people who want to live here and other people who want to build housing for them. The problem is we don't let them. We regulate new housing like it's a nuclear power plant, and we tax it like it's a gold mine. I'm not criticizing the city staff who keep the current system running, like Andrew or Sarah in her former role. They do a lot of hard work to keep things going. The problem is the system, not the people. For city staff, it's like the movie Fury Road. It takes everything you have just to keep moving forward, and you're constantly being attacked by angry people trying to stop you. But let me switch to a more mundane and less heroic view of the current system. I've talked about the costs of housing scarcity at the region-wide level. To fix this, we need more housing, and this has traditionally been approved at the municipal level. Municipal governments have tight zoning restrictions on most of their land, making it illegal to build apartment buildings. The thing is, it's pretend zoning. They sell permission to build apartment buildings one at a time through spot rezoning. As part of this process, they collect a lot of revenue, as Andrew talked about, with various names, impact charges, development charges, or CACs. This allows them to keep property taxes low. This means that under the current system, municipal incentives are backwards. They're both a regulator and a vendor. They maximize their revenue by following the OPEC strategy of selling permission to build housing in limited quantities at high prices. If they allowed enough housing to bring down prices and rents, that would be a financial disaster for them because they need the money. This shows how it works. How much a project can pay for land is the selling price of the new building minus all the costs of building it. That's shown on the right, the green part. But the municipality imposes tight restrictions on what you can build, so until you have their permission, the value of the land is heavily discounted, shown in blue. The key thing is, when the municipality agrees to give you permission to build, they charge you 70 to 80% of the land lift. They're taking away your ability to build more housing on your land and then selling it back to you. The problem is the land lift is what provides the incentive to redevelop in the first place. It's also what absorbs cost increases because costs are always changing. It's like a shock absorber. Costs have gone way up since 2019, and because interest rates are higher, prices have also come down. When there's too many bites out of the apple and the land lift is gone, what happens is projects no longer make sense. If you build something and subtract all the costs to build it, you end up with something worth less than what you already have. So then nothing happens until prices and rents rise further. In other words, it's renters and first-time homebuyers who end up paying higher rents and higher prices. This is true for both new and old housing because they compete with each other. When new housing is expensive, old housing will also be expensive. By raising their fees as much as they can, municipalities are raising the floor on prices. Prices cannot drop below total costs. In theory, municipalities could lower their fees to counteract other costs going up, but they're counting on that money. So prices can never go down, they can only go up. Looking again at how the system works from the point of view of the municipality, following that line, everything looks fine. They limit the rate at which things are changing, which keeps their voters happy. And because prices and rents are so high, lots of people want to build, and they can extract a lot of money. They've turned what should be a feedback loop into a money pump. So from the municipal point of view, their incentive is to maintain the housing shortage. And the costs of the housing shortage far outweigh the benefits of the extra revenue. This is why the province needs to intervene. Even without provincial intervention, municipal funding is a huge challenge. There are a lot of needs. A lot of projects have switched from strata to rental, which sells for a lower price and doesn't provide much land lift. One suggestion is to use residential water metering to pay for water and sewer infrastructure. People are willing to pay for water just like they pay for electricity. When you're talking about something that provides benefits to the whole community, like a community center, it's better to use a broad tax base with relatively low rates instead of a narrow tax base with high rates. Trying to get a relatively small number of newcomers to pay the bill means they need to pay a lot. A third suggestion is to use a fixed mill rate. This is common in US cities like Houston. This means that if you're adding a lot of new housing and thus adding to total property value, this automatically provides you more municipal revenue. One final comment. I would emphasize the need for solidarity, the feeling that we're all in this together and we need to cooperate with each other. That's how we got through COVID. Younger people were willing to make sacrifices to protect older people. We need to have the same spirit in tackling the housing shortage. Thank you.
I think we're all really appreciating the movie clips and graphics. Thank you, Russell. Sarah.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here tonight to talk about this admittedly niche and nerdy topic that's also pretty timely, especially because a lot of the rules that are being referred to in the question are actually being called into question. Their future is unknown and will be, I think, one of the outcomes of the upcoming election. So it's a great time to be talking about this tonight. I thought Andrew did a really fantastic job speaking to the con side of the question from the perspective of a large Lower Mainland municipality that's close to transit and is facing a lot of growth pressures. I'm going to speak to some of the parallels and also some of the differences in smaller communities like my very photogenic town of Squamish, where the rules are needed, and there are many parallels to what we've heard tonight already, but where the rules are hitting different in some other ways. So I'll be making my argument in 4 points that while municipalities have absolutely contributed to BC's housing shortage, realizing the province's stated goal of enabling more housing in the right places faster all across the province, including in smaller communities, demands that senior levels of government support municipalities with meeting the pressures coming from densification and growth. I'll argue this perspective based on my previous experience working in a large municipality at the City of Vancouver, and also my work now in Squamish. Okay, well, imagine another slide. So slide number 1 should say, there is a housing shortage in BC. Doesn't bear repeating at this point, but I'll say I started my career working at the City of Vancouver as a housing planner during the summer of 2015. Around the time that the average price of a single-family home surpassed $1 million. This was a watershed moment in Vancouver when the conversation about who needed housing started to shift from being just about homelessness and people facing housing insecurity and started to include the challenges of a broader population, like young people, professionals, and families, probably a lot of the folks sitting in the room today. These challenges have only escalated since that time and spread beyond Vancouver to the rest of BC, and this is what I want to focus on today. Small communities across BC are facing immense growth pressures brought on by a variety of factors, including most recently post-pandemic household movement due to remote work. My current home of Squamish is a prime example. Squamish was one of BC's fastest growing municipalities in the last census, experiencing over a 20% increase in population between 2016 and 2021. Growth pressures have driven escalating rents and prices, up 50% since 2018, and we're seeing rents mirroring those of Vancouver in some places. In this context, it's hard to argue against the need for more types of housing of all types and tenures, missing middle, apartments, rental, and ownership, to create more housing options for growing communities and start to mitigate affordability challenges. For this reason, I actually struggled a bit with taking the no side of this debate, because from my experience inside and outside planning departments, I absolutely see how planning regulations and processes have contributed to housing shortages in BC. Almost every municipality in BC, big or small, has restrictive residential zoning rules that limit how much housing you can build on a single lot. Smaller communities face the same issues around public opposition to needed housing, and in fact, it's worse, because many local councils don't take much 1 or 2 people showing up to a public hearing to say no to housing. Growing municipalities are increasingly relying on development cost charges and in-kind developer contributions to deliver even the most basic infrastructure and local amenities, and in many cases, that puts a squeeze on development. In applying Bills 44, 46, and 47 across BC municipalities, and not just in bigger cities, the province has taken aim at these barriers. But in doing so, it may have also created or exacerbated challenges that many municipalities aren't equipped to deal with on their own, which might risk undermining the goal of enabling the scale of new supply needed to address housing pressures in these communities. Here's the issue. While the new provincial regulations have given municipalities more tools to enable needed housing, and probably given a bit of a kick in the pants to some heel draggers, they've barely scratched the surface on deep underlying infrastructure and capacity issues that in many cases are the real barriers to sustainable growth. This is why I argue that municipalities need to be part of the solution, and especially need to be engaged around their needs and solutions for supports. I give you as an example this image of Brennan Park Community Centre in Squamish, much beloved, but as you can see, a little dumpy. Built in 1977, Brennan Park is home to Squamish's one pool and hockey rink and multi-use spaces. The facility is well over capacity, and staff recently reported a budget of well over $85 million for needed rehabilitation and expansion to serve existing and future community needs. Brennan Park is just one example of a much bigger problem. Back in 2018, Squamish reported that it needed to invest over $170 million just to bring existing municipal facilities up to current needs. And obviously that number is much higher today, given cost escalation. And that's only just part of the picture, since it doesn't include renewal and expansion in underground and road infrastructure, and also infrastructure that's not part of municipal jurisdiction, like highways, transit, schools, hospitals, affordable housing, childcare, and natural amenities and recreation areas, especially important in my community. A recent UBCM report suggested a bill of at least $24 billion to address core infrastructure needs across the province. You'll hear my colleagues potentially argue that municipalities should just raise property taxes or use other sources of revenue to address these infrastructure needs. But by statute, municipalities are very limited in how much debt they can take on to pay for big projects, no more than 25% of their overall budget, and they have relatively small tax bases to raise revenue through property taxes. In Squamish, raising taxes 1% raises about $400,000, far short of what's needed. So big picture, why is this an issue? Small communities are already struggling with big deficits and limited revenues. And in the long run, pressure to increase densification and population may ultimately undermine the goal of creating affordable, livable communities. I have a whole other slide, but we'll maybe speak to it in the questions. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. So I do just want to remind you that you will get to ask, the audience will get to ask questions in a few minutes, but we're going to let the debaters ask each other some questions, and if you don't, I will. Do any of you want to ask your opposing side a question? Oh, okay. Well, here's mine. Here's mine for both of you. What would have been wrong with the province saying you have to set housing targets and you have to meet them, but you figure out how to do it? You can't tell us what your plan is. And places like Coquitlam that are doing well, you can condense your density. Wherever whatever your housing target is, you can condense that density in the places you think it's more efficient. With more recalcitrant communities, who I won't name here tonight, because we all know who they are. You would maybe have more government intervention or monitoring to make sure they're not trying to do what some California cities do, which is just do an end run around the whole housing target thing. So one from each side. What would have been the upside or downside of having the province say, you set the housing target, or we set the housing target, or somebody sets it, but it has to be reasonable. It can't be, a West Van, well, we grew by 10 people last year, so we'll try for 20 this year. So what would have been wrong with setting a housing target and saying to the community, you figure it out?
I guess what I would say is within a city, there's more people who want to live in certain areas. So I guess I'm familiar with the city of Vancouver, and we have SkyTrain stations that were built back in the 1980s that are, the land use around them still hasn't changed. It's like you still have single family houses now because of house prices have risen so much, they're worth over $1 million, maybe $2 million. And it just doesn't make sense that you have a place where a lot of people would want to live so that they have easy access to jobs. And you might have a small family.
So all
of
of
people
that
living.
is true.
Yes.
But how can you not solve that by saying to the city, set a housing target and put the density where you think it works best?
I think we actually have a really good example of that in a federal initiative called the Housing Accelerator Fund, which actually helped municipalities with setting supply targets. And then in addition to holding them accountable to those targets, also incentivizes them by giving cash, basically. That can be used for any number of things, including measures to directly enable that supply, but also pay for infrastructure, staffing, that sort of thing.
So I still would like to hear from this side. What would have been wrong with like not doing the blanket zonings?
I'm just not convinced that the local authority will not result in more of the grand bargain. Like, one of the key issues I pointed to was local control and local feedback results in the echoing of very similar voices that have resulted in places like the Metro Town and the Brentwood, while you have a whole bunch of underlying areas that get to remain untouched. Like, when was the last time we saw something get developed in Shaughnessy, right? So you can set a housing target, but that base level of inequity and who gets a say and who gets to participate, what gets redeveloped, who gets displaced, I don't think you get to solve that problem by just telling cities, do as you please with these targets.
Can I add one more point?
Yeah.
I think a big part of the sort of problem here is that it's really, really slow to get anything approved, because almost all forms of multifamily housing require you to go through this extremely painful and protracted and labor-intensive process. I mean, it's kind of incredible to hear someone say that in Edmonton, it's possible to acquire land and deliver housing in the same calendar year. It's like, from Vancouver, that just seems completely impossible. So just the idea of legalizing forms of housing, whether it's multiplexes or transit-oriented development, without having to go through this super painful process, is, I think, a key part of what the province is trying to do.
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah, I was hoping you would answer, like, will it just perpetuate the same inequity, or the same, like, Vancouver, Burnaby, will pack the housing in far away from our voters?
So
Yeah.
I would note, a great, the province setting kind of broad targets and us figuring out how to meet them would work fine. In Coquitlam, we've got well over 12,000 dwelling units, fully approved by council, zoned with issued development permits, but the builders have not yet submitted an application for a building permit. They're choosing to limit the supply of housing because, for whatever reason, it doesn't pencil out for them to launch pre-sales or build projects now. And so we've got a 5-year supply, fully approved. The city's done all of our work, and it's not translating into actual housing starts on the ground because there's larger macroeconomic factors at play that influence housing beyond just zoning approvals and timelines and local government control. We can approve all the housing we want, but we need the development community to actually construct it.
Okay, I see Russell twitching here.
Right. So I would say there's two bottlenecks here, right? There's the approval bottleneck and there's the cost bottleneck. And I guess that was the point of the graph I put up, where you have the value of the housing that can be built, and then you have to subtract all the costs that go into that. So the municipalities have some amount of control over the cost bottleneck. One is through the fees that they impose on new housing. And the other, I would say, is the amount of density that they allow. This may be less of an issue in Coquitlam, but the more density you can put on, the lower the cost of land per square foot. So, the point of the Star Wars meme was that because costs have gone up, that land lift is gone. It no longer makes sense to actually carry out these projects that have been approved. And there are things that the municipalities can do to try to offset those headwinds. But the incentives of the municipalities are just to say, well, it's out of our hands. We need to wait because we need the money. We can't sacrifice this revenue. There's currently a fight going on between Metro Vancouver Regional District, which has also raised DCCs, and a whole bunch of developers and builders who are saying, look, you're just like putting the brakes on development and we're going to have an even worse housing shortage. But the response from Metro Van Chair is like, well, we need the money.
Yes.
So, it's interesting, and I, there's kind of dueling arguments that everything that adds into the cost of housing, the cost of concrete and land and municipal fees and everything else, adds up to the price of housing and it has an inflationary effect on the price. Or I've seen economists also argue that the market price of housing is a market price and everything comes off the residual land value. You add up all your hard and soft costs, and both of those arguments can't be true. Either the costs have to have an inflationary effect on the price, or it's a fixed market price and it has a downward effect on the underlying land value. What's interesting, I think, in that is the way land value capture works. It's a way to suppress windfall profits for existing property owners. If the province builds a new $4 billion SkyTrain line and everyone's property value in that area increases significantly, you want some of that unearned windfall profit to come back to the community to pay for the cost of all the infrastructure and the amenities. You know, the cost of your house isn't just the cost of the lumber and the concrete and the tile and the carpet and the drywall. Part of it is your proportional cost of water pipes and sewer pipes and parks and roads and streets and street lighting and all the other things that you need to support your house. So it's not just that you buy your house, you also have to buy your proportion cost of all of the infrastructure in your city to support that.
Can I?
Right, but don't those people pay for that through their taxes?
No, property taxes are operating costs, not capital.
Okay, yeah, Helen.
Yeah, the land value capture, I don't understand why it has to be focused on new development, right? Like everyone uses our infrastructure, everyone uses these benefits in our communities. And I think earlier we had a conversation about how, you know, a single family home that has a couple bathrooms, I think Francis, you raised this, could be replaced by a brand new single family homes that now has 8 bathrooms instead of 2. There's no capture in that process to pay for the increased impact on infrastructure. So I think the land value capture right now is very narrowly focused, and it ends up being on new development, which is already burdened by all of these other costs that are coming off of it, and is making it really challenging to actually be built and be feasible. But earlier, you know, going back to the point of why not just set housing targets, I think it's also important to remember that I believe what the province is doing is not just saying that we need much more new housing, but also saying that the way we've been doing housing and the baseline status quo has not been okay, and that there needs to be a new way, meaning we need more density. We need a new baseline of we should be building more multiplexes, because by doing this, it's not only addressing our housing shortage, it's also addressing other goals like environmental goals and carbon impact of all of our single family areas.
Okay, one more, and then I want to get on to one other question from me, and then on to the audience. But go ahead, Russell.
All right, I just want to emphasize the principle that there's no free lunch. So when we talk about like an unearned windfall, yeah, somebody has to pay for money that's being extracted. So if the city of Vancouver collected $2.5 billion over 10 years from 2011 to 2020 in supposedly voluntary community amenity contributions, that doesn't just come out of the ground like a gold mine. Yeah, and because municipalities have not left land lift on the table because they've taken it already, when you increase costs, what has to happen is that prices and rents have to rise. In other words, the person who's paying the bill is renters and first-time homebuyers. And once again, it doesn't just affect people in new housing, it affects people all across the city in existing housing as well as new housing because they compete with each other.
Okay, we could go on just about this. I can see it's a really great topic. One question for you. It looks like in Coquitlam, it's nirvana out there. You had beautiful community meetings where everyone kissed at the end. People invited homeless people to come and live in their houses. It sounded beautiful. And I've heard this before in Vancouver. Like the Knight and Clark project is very famous for Anne McAfee saying, oh my God, we worked really hard with the community, and then 70 people showed up to the public hearing and we were gonna tear our hair out, what did we do wrong? And they all showed up and said, this is really great, we support it, and you know, had never been heard of before in council. The problem is a lot of communities are not seeing that. For various reasons. The process has gotten so polarized. You can barely have a conversation anymore. You try to have a poll of residents to get the people who don't come out to the meetings, and people have found ways to rig the poll in the survey in the area. And so isn't part of the argument that you guys are doing a great job, but many others aren't, for whatever reason. And so we're just going to put this in, and people will just get used to the fact that it's not just single family houses that get approved easily and automatically. It's other forms. So that's my question. Isn't there the possibility that this new provincial approach, as much as people are like, God, how are we going to make this work, will eventually result in a new generation of residents who go, yeah, this is how things happen, like this building is going up and, it was in the plan and, the province said it and we're all fine with it. Like, isn't there a possibility that that has that kind of an impact? Because honestly, your kind of community engagement is beautiful and it's not what I see a lot of.
I suppose, it's possible eventually we'll get there, but I'm concerned about what it means in the interim. As I said, it's really helpful when you're building a community when everyone has consensus and is all pulling in the same direction. And it means that instead of just me, the planner, pushing things forward or the province snowplowing things forward, I've got 150,000 people in Coquitlam. Okay, I don't have all of them, but even if I've got half of them all saying this is a good idea, those many hands make light work and we're all working together to build the community we want. And it minimizes that sort of opposition and that friction that we see. And it leads to a much more appreciative community. It leads to better public debate. There's a whole lot of positive benefits from removing that sort of acrimonious interaction that you have when people feel things are imposed on them.
So how do you make it like that in other communities where it's not happening?
Yeah, and I'll say, from my experience in Vancouver, but also Squamish, there's a small neighborhood that's been undergoing a community plan. It's looking at infill. It's, Squamish has a pretty strict urban growth boundary, and they're trying to densify rather than grow into the mountains. It's been really acrimonious. And I know the planners there, even though they have some gripes about the provincial rules, on balance, actually see that it's been really helpful to have kind of another body to point to. That's
You're arguing on the wrong
the trouble is that there's still when it actually comes time to build the housing and when you actually get to beyond the community planning process, where it's pretty easy to end up with a document that everyone can has lots of nice pictures. We all say kumbaya. When it comes to actually approving the individual homes, that's where things get difficult. And I was speaking before to the example of a local builder who's building Squamish's first fourplex under the provincial rules. The neighborhood plan hasn't gone through yet, and the community, which was starting to come around to the neighborhood plan, which is going to enable much more than fourplexes, have totally taken out the pitchforks for this one development. So it's
well, and that's what I'm wondering about. Is there not a risk that this kind of oxytocin drip policy making, for those of you who've been through labor, you'll know what I mean, that it's going to produce a backlash?
Yeah, we're already seeing that. We're seeing, in 2 weeks we're going to have the provincial election. John Rustad said he would repeal all the housing legislation, so we'll spend the next year undoing all the work we've done over the last year to implement it. And I think that's what I meant by bringing the community on side. So you've got everyone, council, the community, staff, the development community, all understanding and agreeing on the direction. It's more resilient to change. Individual politicians or whims or swings in policy direction can't undo those changes. Whereas you could see an individual council goes through a local election, the provincial election changes, and the rules could change wildly. And those swings back and forth are much more disruptive than building consensus where everyone's moving forward in a common direction that's more resilient to those changes in political winds.
I'm sure you guys have something.
Sure. Yeah. So, I guess what I would always emphasize is that we're in a terrible situation. It's like if we had a reasonable amount of housing stock and then we had an earthquake or some other natural disaster that destroyed a quarter of it. It's like, we've got people sleeping in vehicles, we've got people crowding into substandard housing. A quarter of all people in BC are planning to leave in the next 5 years. I think something like half of people under 35 are thinking seriously about leaving BC. And whenever I spend a lot of time talking to people about housing, whenever I'm talking to younger people and they ask, how long is it going to take before things are actually visibly better? I don't know what to tell them. So, I understand the benefits of having a slower process that builds consensus and so on. But I would argue that, this is a really desperate situation and we really need to move forward quickly. I would also point out that the Conservatives a week and a half ago said that they are also willing to override municipalities. in a different way, unfortunately. So it means that if they win the election, then you'll probably have to undo some of the changes you made and do a whole new set of changes.
Just keep the rotating various policy papers. Yeah, we're all ready. We've got this one. Okay, I'd like to hear from the audience, and I'm not sure what the process is, if there's someone roaming around with a microphone or if you just yell out from the dark, or I see a hand here in the front.
I'm just wondering exactly what you just said. Does that like set a dangerous precedent? Could this be wrong in that it would set a precedent that the province could step in more often, and if we have a different party in power with different priorities that are not about increasing affordable housing, then they could mandate things that are totally different. Just a jurisdictional question, like we're taking the power more into like the province that's further away from people instead of at the local level.
Right. So I guess I would emphasize or call back to what Francis said, which is the province definitely has this power. Like the saying is, municipalities are creatures of the province. Or they're created by provincial legislation. So yeah, if the province wanted to, if we had some future provincial government that just wanted to put their stamp on everything, they could dissolve all the municipalities and rule from Victoria. I think Francis mentioned that in Ontario, the provincial government changed the number of councillors on Toronto City Council, or they forced amalgamation of Toronto. So they have this power. In the Constitution, I think municipalities don't exist. They're just created by legislation.
So her question was, isn't there a danger if the province has all this power?
I would say yes, distributed decision-making and distributed authority is more resilient to those political winds of change. For every great politician, there's another Donald Trump politician, and there's danger of concentrating power.
Okay, on that really depressing note, I can hardly see, but are there other questions? I see a hand like way back there next to the green shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. I think part of this debate tonight, and this is a question for anyone, I think part of this debate is about whether these changes from the province are too heavy-handed or not nuanced enough. My question is, the province has allowed some municipalities to have extensions to figure out these changes and work with the nuances of their specific municipality and context. And you could argue that the public engagement, although taken away from rezoning, has maybe just been shifted prior in the process to the OCP stage, the official community plan stage. So is that not an argument potentially for or against the province's changes?
Yeah, I want to remind us that the province coming in with these policies we're not upzoning, right? We still have to go through the process of rezoning, and I think I agree. There's still lots of opportunity for engagement. Sorry, I totally forgot the other half of what I was going to say, so I'm going to pass it over.
No, it's okay.
Yeah.
But they are forcing upzoning. So by the end of next year, we need to pre-zone for 20 years of supply according to our housing needs assessments. So we are required to pre-zone, and we are upzoning as well.
Right. I remember the other part I was going to say now. And I think that it's easy to kind of look back in the last year, 2 years or whatnot, look at all this policy and go, it's valid criticism that there's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of what's going on, what's the actual policy. And to that, I would say that, there's been tons of city plans and policies that have been written and refined for decades and decades and decades, and still I submit something to the city and there's confusion and conflict. So you can have all the time in the world and it's still like, what does this mean? Well, let's talk to city engineering. Nope, that's different than what's Parks telling me. So I don't think that's a valid, we need a little bit more time. It's only fair that we give the province a little bit more time. The cities have had lots of time.
Great. Yes, here.
Thanks. Nanaimo Station on the Expo line, it's a lot of single-family homes next to maybe one of the most frequent rapid transit lines in the world. It's about a 10-minute ride from the center of our urban region, the busiest city in the province. And then a few stations east of there is Metrotown, where the most affordable housing had been displaced with luxury housing. And that's where the city chose to concentrate redevelopment. And then just on the other side of the street, single family homes were protected. So it just strikes me as two really bad, but also opposing outcomes from the status quo. Discuss.
And actually, we were talking about the Nanaimo Station development just
Exactly.
before we started here.
Yeah, we
That's
were
right.
just talking about this, and you know, the Nanaimo station, you know, there's a couple stations along the Expo line where it's the same pattern. It's like tons of single-family homes, and then, you know, one or maybe a little bit of like a commercial center, but not much else. So the City of Vancouver line on why that hasn't happened is infrastructure. That there's a huge, to an extent, even unknown infrastructure bill that has to be covered to support densification in those areas. It's not an excuse, it's an explanation. But it kind of goes back to this sort of core issue of, you know, obviously you can charge new development to an extent to cover that infrastructure, but if it doesn't cover it all, what do you do? And if it, especially if those charges actually keep the development from happening.
Right. Yeah, I would describe this pattern where the city of Vancouver, it seems pretty difficult to get things approved, whereas other municipalities like Coquitlam or Surrey, you can have like a 40-story building proposed and like nobody shows up to the public hearing. So what happens is it's like pushing down on a balloon. Like the people who would have lived in, who would prefer to live in Vancouver don't just vanish because Vancouver's not building enough housing. They like move further out. And yeah, when we only allow housing in a limited area like Metrotown, what happens is you get this tremendous pressure that results in like high rises precisely because we don't allow any other change, like, as you said, across the street to the single family areas. In terms of infrastructure funding, you know, obviously that is a challenge. As a layperson, like not somebody who's involved in either development or regulation, I do find it puzzling that, you know, we're talking about digging up the streets and putting pipes in the ground. It doesn't seem like a technical challenge. Is it purely just a matter of finding the money? And is that the reason why we have not developed Nanaimo and 29th Avenue stations?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't work for Vancouver, but yes, that's my understanding is it would be incredibly expensive and they're prioritizing, they've got more infrastructure investment across the whole city and they're prioritizing where that happens.
Yeah. You didn't bring up an interesting thing that you said when we were chatting informally, which is that part of what Coquitlam is doing, that Andrew's doing, is a year-long audit just to figure out what their infrastructure is and what'll happen if someone does put, you know, 5 multiplexes in a cul-de-sac, you know, miles from anywhere, kilometers from anywhere.
Yes, we're lucky we're one of the municipalities that does have an extension on the small scale multi-unit housing or the 4plexes everywhere. And the reason the province granted us the extension was solely to give us the time to complete an infrastructure analysis so we can actually understand our utility networks, our water and wastewater systems, and where those constraints are to growth so that we can actually develop a capital plan for how we're going to prioritize and fund that infrastructure and where the upgrades are needed to support that growth. But in the interim, we don't know where that is or what's needed. And my concern, you know, particularly on the small scale side, is it might not be the first or the second 4plex on a block that triggers all the sewer upgrades. It could be the 5th or the 6th. But if I haven't collected money from the first couple, I don't want to stick the full bill to replace the entire block's worth of pipes on that last building. Or it's easy to also concentrate and say, okay, this area is going to grow first and I'm going to prioritize all the infrastructure upgrades there. Right now, I'm just spreading the peanut butter very thin across the whole city and everyone gets a tiny little bit of infrastructure upgrades, but utilities are a network. Those pipes have to connect to something. And I have to ensure that I'm doing that in a rational way.
Thank you. I do see the other hands up there and I'm being told that time is up, which is so mean. Could we do one more? I think we have the time. And so there was a gentleman, you had your hand up for a long time in that row somewhere there.
Yeah, in the maroon?
Yes. Okay. It wasn't you, but whatever. The other person put his hand down, so you got the floor.
So I have a question for the Contra team. Sarah, you have a background working in organizing in Boston. And the city of Boston released some statistics on who participates in its public engagement recently. And they found that 75% of participants were homeowners, even though only 32% of residents are. And 70% of participants had lived in the city for at least 20 years, although only 16% of residents did. And Andrew, you mentioned how important it is to use this public engagement process to get everybody pulling in the same direction. But my question is, who intercedes to defend the interests of renters and newcomers who don't seem like they're a part of this consensus?
That's a really good point. I know when I was working at the city, we really tried to strive for 50-50 representation of owners and renters in the engagement that we were doing on housing, just because of what you said. There's kind of an incumbent bias in any kind of engagement that you do, and if you just go out and ask the question around what do you want the future of your neighborhood to be, in all likelihood, if you don't really try, you're probably going to hear more from homeowners who've been there a long time versus from renters who, I imagine everyone who rents in this room, you've probably moved at least once in the last few years and might not feel the same kind of connection to your neighborhood, or even hear if something is happening. So I think that's totally true. I don't know that it necessarily means we need to stop engaging. I think it just means we need to engage better.
I think, building on that, it's all about how you do engagement. Part of that's my job as a planner, is to ensure that I'm soliciting from as many of those diverse voices as possible and spending extra effort to go to those underrepresented communities and solicit their voices. I've done lots of engagement where I've, walked out on the pool deck while kids were having swimming lessons and handed cards to the parents and said, hey, please fill out this survey, or stood at the SkyTrain station and, as people are going past, said, hey, we're doing this thing. We want you to fill out this survey. You don't need to stop now. I know you're busy. But finding ways of finding those communities and actually going to them and meet people where they are to make it easier for them to participate and lower that bar. And then also moderating the feedback. If I'm collecting demographic information, I can moderate that, okay, I did this survey or talked to these people and I only heard from this, my demographic research or my knowledge and everything else is also telling me I need to insert this other voice. And that's my job to help balance those and create a fuller picture of what we're hearing.
Okay, that was great. It's not really what we're voting on, but it's a good explanation of how you're trying to improve the public process so it's not seen as the barrier that it is now. Okay, sadly, that's all the time I have for public questions because I blathered on too much. I apologize. So now for closing remarks, where they're going to come up with something surprising, new, revealing, that'll just sway you totally. Okay, so Helen, you're up first. 2 minutes.
I think in summary, again, like I mentioned, I just think that planners in cities have had a very, very long time of having local control. They've had a lot of fairly well-intentioned policies and plans that I think we agree with for our cities and for our communities. But I think, unfortunately, that the delivery of these plans have resulted in some cumbersome and lengthy processes, and it results in really real consequences, such as our current housing shortage, and therefore closely tied to it, the immense erosion of affordability. And then compounding this issue is the fact that local municipal politicians and the subsequent policies just aren't incentivized to address these issues for reasons that, Russil pointed out, but mostly, again, because they're responding to people who are the squeaky wheels at the city level, which are often a very select representation of our societies and our communities. And many of them don't want to see change, and they also massively benefit from housing values that increase with an ongoing shortage. A theme I keep hearing about is concerns about infrastructure. And I think that we have lots of really smart planners and engineers and consultants, and we should absolutely be planning for capital upgrade plans. And I'm surprised to hear that we don't already have more of this. And honestly, I would rather our problem be how do we figure out how to fund our infrastructure rather than we can't build the housing we need because of arbitrary rules and, select local interests. So in summary, I think the province was right to take action because they're responding and acting with urgency to appropriately because this is a crisis. And more importantly, we can't just continue to plan and plan and plan. We have to be accountable to our plans and we have to actually do what we are setting out to do.
Thank you. So I'm going to postulate that I think the province is trying to solve the wrong problem. Do we need to loosen up zoning regulations and have more housing? Certainly, and we've been doing lots of that in Coquitlam and streamlining the approvals process. But we've seen, across the world, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, parts of the US, across Canada, my hometown of Halifax, where housing prices have skyrocketed, in England and other parts of Western Europe. Places that all share a similar economic system and investment system and economy, but have drastically different political parties and zoning and planning regulations and approvals processes, all around the same time period started to see cost escalation rapidly around housing. That suggests to me there's broader macroeconomic factors at play, and those are ones that perhaps the development community, who's saying the loudest that we need to fix zoning in the approvals process, and the real estate industry don't want to change, because there's reasons for that make them money, or they like the current economic system. And I think you need to follow the money until you realize that housing's expensive, not just in cost, to also produce, and you got to figure out where that money is coming from. And this isn't an argument against, say, the financialization or investment in housing. You need investment, but the types of investment and the types of financialization are important. And we've seen a drastic shift over the last little while, where now that if developers feel they can't meet their sales target and their price point, even if society needs housing, they don't launch that project, and housing sits on the shelf. So, pumping out more housing approvals and more zoning doesn't necessarily lead to more housing unless the money is there to support that housing and the developers feel like they're confident building it. But that suggests to me there's larger macroeconomic factors at play that are influencing our housing market beyond zoning and development approvals.
Okay, that'll be the next debate. What is the problem?
Wow, Andrew, I kind of wish you'd started with that, because I would have spent a lot more time arguing against that. To me, it's actually a fairly simple problem. I talk to people all the time who are like, is this really solvable? Can we really fix this? And to me, it is actually really simple. People want to live and work here, and other people really want to build housing for them, and we don't let them. If you look at a place like Austin, which has a much more permissive approval system, there was kind of this boom and bust thing where people moved to Austin during COVID, prices and rents went way up, people launched a lot of projects, and now, rents are coming down. There's actually some people who are going bankrupt because they bought in at a certain price, and now it's going down. But to return to what I wanted to say about my closing statement, so younger people are being crushed and driven out by the high cost of housing. It's a terrible situation, and it's bad for everyone. The current system is backwards because it's based on the idea that housing is unwanted, that you need to beg for permission to build it, and that it's reasonable to stick new residents with as much of the bill as you can. It fails to recognize that not building housing imposes huge costs. There's two bottlenecks: approval and costs. Without provincial intervention, municipalities are moving in exactly the wrong direction on the cost bottleneck, trying to increase their impact charges as much as they can. They're making things worse. On the approval bottleneck, I think municipalities are moving in the right direction, but it's agonizingly slow. It's like there's a train being chased by a monster. The people driving the train are reluctant to go any faster. Meanwhile, at the back of the train, people are being eaten alive.
Whoa. Okay, Sarah, you bring it home after that.
That was grim. I guess I'm a little worried. We have a lot of lens and focus and I think more accountability in the Lower Mainland for municipalities actually living up to the spirit of these rules. But I think in the rest of BC, where there isn't this focus, I think there's a real risk of this being a big paper exercise and not actually having a meaningful impact on what we're all trying to achieve, which is more housing and livable communities that are welcoming to all people. And so I think that's the risk of top-down measures that don't kind of take into account kind of the big picture and the different restrictions and limitations that are facing smaller communities. And it is an all-of-province initiative. It's not just a Lower Mainland initiative. And so I think that really does need to be considered. And that's why I think you should move over to the con side of the question.
Okay, so now you get to vote again. Perfectly okay to change your mind. And the QR code is there. I don't know if anyone needed a paper ballot last time or wants one this time. Can you like wave frantically as though you're drowning? Sure. Or something?
Are we allowed to? Are we allowed to vote?
Do we get to vote?
What?
No, okay.
I think so.
Wouldn't change
Why
our vote,
not?
would we?
No.
Apparently David Eby won the provincial debate. I don't know. I'm just going by the group Twitter feed of my journalist friends who said it was mostly horrible, but Eby scored with a $13 billion deficit, scored a point against Rustad by asking him why he hadn't costed his program. Okay, so it's very hard for the pro side because they started so high, so that makes it really difficult for them. So here's the results. So the first vote was pro 80, con 20. Second vote, pro 78. Wow. Con 22. I like to think this is how the first of Andrew's 1,200 community meetings went.
This is a form of public engagement.
Okay, so the winners are Andrew and Sarah. So congratulations.
Did I get those trophies?
All right.
Oh.
2%. 2%. That's all we needed.
Stand up here.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, and for really kind of holding back the dike from, springing too many leaks whatsoever, were our also winners, Russil and Helen.
I think it's a better prize. I want a t-shirt.
So thank you everyone so much.